Lucius Pedanius Secundus was a man of weighty responsibilities. As prefect of Rome during the reign of Nero, he was charged with maintaining order in a city filled to bursting with roughly 1 million residents. Authorized to punish crimes, the city prefect had command of troops and used them as a police force to keep revelers in line during festivals and games. He and his men were also there to guard against insurrection by Rome's many slaves. The great city Pedanius Secundus watched over was the pulsing heart of the empire and owed its vitality to the rivers, roads, and aqueducts that served as its arteries, benefiting rich and poor alike. While only the wealthiest residents had baths in their homes, fed by spurs from the aqueducts or by water drawn by slaves from one of the hundreds of fountains or basins around the city, Romans of all classes visited the public baths and frequented public lavatories with running water. A great sewer called the Cloaca Maxima funneled the refuse into the Tiber. Poor Romans, whose dingy apartments lacked kitchens, could still feast their eyes on fresh produce offered at stalls in the bustling marketplaces, and pick up something there for dinner, perhaps, or stop for a bite at one of the many taverns. For all its attractions, Rome was a dangerous place, and the prefect had much to worry about. The streets were so narrow that all wagons, except those carrying building materials, were barred from using them before nightfall. Nonetheless, pedestrians who were not careful might still be knocked over in broad daylight by charioteers bound for a race at the Circus Maximus, or have their feet trampled by soldiers wearing sharp-studded shoes, or be shoved aside by slaves clearing a path for their noble master, riding above the fray in his litter. Anyone who was foolish enough to venture out alone at night for some refreshment or a rendezvous with one of the city's brightly clad prostitutes ran the risk of being mugged, and staying home after dark did not ensure one's safety, for neither bolts nor guard dogs provided adequate protection against Rome's bold and resourceful burglars. Wealthy Romans responded to such threats by surrounding themselves with bodyguards, but no one was entirely safe from crime, not even Pedanius Secundus himself. One day in AD 61, Rome's prefect and guardian of public order was found murdered in his home. The identity of the victim was shocking enough, but the circumstances were even more so. He was slain not by some intruding ruffian, but by one of his own household slaves. The motive for the murder remained unclear. Some said that the victim had reneged on a promise to let the slave purchase his freedom for a set price. Valued household slaves received occasional tips and presents, and some in positions of responsibility were rewarded by their masters with a peculium, or nest egg. Others attributed the murder to jealousy, claiming that the prefect had made advances to a man the killer himself was infatuated with. Whatever the provocation, Roman law decreed that the slave must die for his deed, and he would not be the only one to pay with his life. In such cases, all the slaves in the victim's household were considered guilty by association and subject to the death penalty as well. The murdered prefect had a huge retinue of slaves, some 400 men, women, and children. Whether to execute hundreds for the crime of one man became a matter of intense debate in Rome. Many people thought that a mass execution in this instance would be an outrage, and angry crowds supporting the slaves besieged the Senate when it convened to consider their fate. According to the historian Tacitus, there was some feeling among the senators, most of whom had large numbers of slaves themselves, that the proposed penalty was too sweeping and severe. But Gaius Cassius Longinus, a descendant of the man of that same name who had helped plan the assassination of Julius Caesar, demanded death for all concerned. Exempt them from penalty if you like, he warned the doubters. But then, if the city prefect was not important enough to be immune, who will be? Who will have enough slaves to protect him if Pedanius's 400 were too few? Cassius Longinus scoffed at the idea that the killer could have acted without the knowledge or help of others. Do you believe that a slave can have planned to kill his master without letting fall a single rash or menacing word? Or even if we assume he kept his secret and obtained a weapon unnoticed, could he have passed the watch, opened the bedroom door, carried in a light, and committed the murder without anyone knowing? The speaker added that stern measures were needed to discipline a population of slaves culled from many alien nations. The only way to keep down this scum is by intimidation. Yes, innocent people would suffer, he conceded, but individual wrongs are outweighed by the advantage of the community. None of the senators opposed his assertions, but the hordes of Romans agitating for clemency had reason to doubt that the executions benefited their community. A few major slave revolts in the past, such as the uprising of the gladiator Spartacus and his followers in 73 BC, had indeed threatened the society at large. But in this case, the offense was largely of concern to people of means. You have as many enemies as you have slaves, went the old saying, and household slaves had access to their masters at the most vulnerable of times. Ruled by their fears, the senators voted to approve the death sentences. An irate mob, armed with rocks and torches, tried to block the execution, but Nero sent troops to quell the protest, and the condemned were led to their deaths. For one dignitary, named Sigonius Varro, not even the execution of 400 people was sufficient punishment. He wanted the freed slaves who had been serving under the victim's roof at the time of his murder deported. Nero, however, rejected that proposal as unjust. Perhaps this singular act of clemency on his part was meant as a concession to the large Roman population of ex-slaves or freedmen, some of whom had risen from servitude to become prominent businessmen and imperial administrators. Their success demonstrated that the Roman social order, for all its inequities, afforded opportunities for advancement. The fate of the prefect slaves dramatized the perils for those at the lowest rungs, but many slaves, ex-slaves, and common citizens found ways of profiting by their talents and raising their status. It was not just Roman aristocrats who distinguished themselves, but people of lowly origins like Tiro, slave to the orator Cicero, who won his freedom by serving brilliantly as his master's confidential secretary, or the poet Horace, a freedman's son who earned support from the rich and powerful in Rome, but celebrated in verse the humble virtues of the countryside as personified by his old neighbor, the tenant farmer Ophilus. Other men and women of plain heritage around the empire made smaller but lasting impressions on posterity by asserting their rights in court or by succeeding in business, like those who made Pompeii such a vibrant place on the eve of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. As their stories confirm, the Roman world was a stage where actors from every walk of life could make the most of their assigned roles or aspire to new ones. For Cicero and Tiro, the ties that bound master to slave could not have been stronger. Raised in the 1st century BC in Cicero's house at Arpinum, not far from Rome, Tiro was younger than his master, who belonged to the second level of Rome's elite, the wealthy equestrian order, but used his fortune and great oratorical skills to rise to senatorial rank and win election as consul. Among the assets that helped Cicero achieve such distinction as novus homo, or new man, was the gifted Tiro. Early on, someone in the household, perhaps Cicero himself, recognized in the eager slave boy the markings of a good secretary and provided him with instruction. Like Cicero and other upper-class Romans, Tiro became literate in Latin and most likely mastered Greek as well. As an educated household slave, Tiro fared far better than most others in bondage. There were more than 100,000 slaves in Rome alone, and perhaps as many as 2 million throughout all of Italy. Few were as fortunate as Cicero's secretary was. Many were born into slavery, others were scooped up as foundlings or were seized by pirates or by conquering Roman armies. Some slaves performed back-breaking labor in mines or served as oarsmen on merchant ships. Other unfortunates worked for their masters as prostitutes or fighters, powered treadmills or cleaned public buildings, or toiled on rural estates where their rations were measured out as meticulously as feed for the livestock. A treatise on agriculture by Cato the Elder advised estate owners to nourish their slaves on grain or bread, inferior wine from grape skins, and those olives that were not worth pressing for oil. Cato added that masters should retrieve from their slaves their old tunics and cloaks to be made into patchworks. Some slaves were branded by their masters, and others were fitted with iron collars so that they could be identified and returned if they ran away. "I have escaped from my post," read the collar on one Roman slave. "Return me to the barber shop near the temple of Flora." Even household slaves performing congenial tasks in comfortable surroundings sometimes endured shameful treatment, for they had no right to refuse their master's sexual advances. Slaves with conscientious owners might escape such indignities, but they were still expected to flatter their superiors. Tiro excelled at such courtesies and continued to beguile Cicero and company even after winning his freedom. "What a charmer you are," Cicero once wrote to him. "We spent 2 hours at Therium, and our host Xenomenes is as fond of you as though he had been your bosom companion." As a slave, Tiro was definitely legally in a res mancipi, or item of purchase, meaning that he could be sold or rented out like other forms of property. His only protection against being bought or borrowed was to make himself indispensable to Cicero, and he did just that by taking on a variety of important tasks. While Cicero busied himself in Rome with a public career that led him to the consulship in 63 BC, Tiro may well have acted as his bookkeeper and helped manage his several country estates. It was as Cicero's secretary, however, that Tiro made his greatest contribution. Using a system of shorthand that he perfected called Tironian notes, he recorded many of Cicero's remarks and speeches and helped preserve his eloquence in writing. More than a scribe, he served as an editor and advisor to Cicero, who once described the manuscripts they produced as my, or our, literary brain-children. Perhaps Tiro made himself too valuable to Cicero as a slave, for while the orator often talked of freeing him, that reward was long in coming. It must have been difficult for Tiro to press the matter, for all masters expected fides, or selfless loyalty, from their slaves, and Cicero's vanity was such that he saw himself in the best light and expected others to do the same. Could the man who was hailed as the father of his country be anything but a just and generous master? Yet the fact remained that as Tiro entered his 40s, having devoted his life to Cicero, he was still a slave. He had no reason to complain of his surroundings, whether he was minding one of his master's country estates, or conferring with Cicero at his gracious townhouse, faced with Greek marble and shaded by elm trees on the fashionable Palatine Hill. Even the best-kept slave, however, labored under a burden of anxiety. What if his master lost his fortune, or came under attack by political opponents? Under Roman law, a slave who was called to testify in court could be tortured before being questioned, a measure thought necessary to wring the truth from slaves. Indeed, any master for a fee could have authorities torture or kill one of his slaves and dispose of the body. A fond master like Cicero would never subject Tiro to such treatments, but the slaves of a kind owner who died or fell into debt might end up in cruel hands. Some masters flogged their slaves for infractions as minor as failing to fetch hot water fast enough. A few sadists delighted in devising novel ways to torture or kill errant slaves. The Roman author Pliny the Elder told of a jaded equestrian named Vidius Polo, who stocked the ponds at his home with flesh-eating lamprey eels, and fed to them slaves condemned for one offense or another, simply because he relished seeing a man torn to pieces. Once, while entertaining the Emperor Augustus, Pollio ordered a slave boy thrown to the eels for breaking a glass. Disgusted by his host's brutality, Augustus blocked the execution by ordering every glass in the house broken to show that the boy could not be punished for doing as the emperor did. For Tiro, freedom represented not just protection from the random cruelties of slavery, but a chance to taste the precious liberties extolled by Cicero and by earlier Greek and Roman orators he took as his models. Some Romans drew up wills bequeathing the gift of liberty to their slaves, but Tiro had no certainty of outliving his owner and could only hope that Cicero would follow the example of other masters who granted slaves freedom for services rendered. A fertile slave woman, for example, might be emancipated for bearing several sons, who would remain the property of her master after she herself was freed. Surely Tiro had done enough to warrant a similar reward. At last Cicero set a date to free Tiro, perhaps prompted by concern for the health of his ailing slave. "You must get ready to restore your services to my muses," Cicero wrote encouragingly to the convalescing Tiro in April of 53 BC. "My promise will be performed on the appointed day." A month or two later, the orator's younger brother Quintus wrote to congratulate Cicero for freeing Tiro. "Believe me, I jumped for joy," Quintus exulted, after commending Cicero for acknowledging Tiro's former condition to be below his deserts and preferring us to have him as a friend rather than as a slave. Loyalty in a slave was one thing, Quintus went on, but Tiro was to be valued all the more for his literary accomplishments and conversation and culture. As a freedman, or libertas, Tiro was entitled to Roman citizenship and eligible to own property. However, his fealty to Cicero did not end with his manumission, for Tiro now became Cicero's client, and as such was expected to show his patron not only fides, but other forms of devotion, including pietas, or the respect due a father from his son, and perhaps opere, or services, in the form of a number of days of work each year. Tiro continued to act as Cicero's secretary and collaborator and likely received financial rewards for his services because he eventually purchased property in the country. Cicero's son, off studying in Athens in 44 BC, wrote Tiro to congratulate him on his acquisition. "You must shed your town-bred ways. You are now a Roman squire." Not all freedmen fared so well. Many, liberated not just from slavery but from the comforts of their master's home, could afford nothing better than a cramped apartment in one of Rome's rickety tenements, or insulae, up to 6 stories high and prone to fires and cave-ins. Some freedmen, using skills acquired in bondage, set themselves up as artisans, rented shops on the ground floors of apartment buildings, and lived in the shop or an adjoining room. Tenement dwellers endured stifling heat in the summers and shriveling cold in the winter, moderated only slightly by the faint glow of small charcoal braziers. Plumbing was scarce or non-existent, and pots of flowers in the few windows were often the sole adornments. Cicero, himself a slumlord, complained to a friend that 2 of the tenements he owned had collapsed and that others had gaping cracks. Conditions were so bad, he confided, that not only the tenants but even the mice have moved out. Even after achieving the status of a landowner, Tiro still acknowledged Cicero as his patron. A client owed his patron the honor of hailing him regularly at his home and perhaps forming part of his entourage when he traveled in his litter to the Forum or the Senate. As patron and client, Cicero and Tiro would never be equals, but their relationship was not only cordial but intimate, much like that between a father and son. Cicero once urged the absent Tiro in a letter to take good care of his health. "If you love me, and if you don't, you make a pretty pretense of it." Cicero went on to remind Tiro what good health required: digestion, no fatigue, a short walk, massage, proper evacuation. Mind you come back in good shape. Bonds of duty and affection dictated that Tiro would not challenge or embarrass Cicero during his lifetime. No small matter, given Tiro's thorough knowledge of his patron's foibles. Accordingly, Tiro waited until after Cicero's death in 43 BC by execution at the behest of Mark Antony to write a biography of the orator. Although Tiro's account was lost, it reportedly dealt more frankly with Cicero's life than his late master might have wished. Yet Tiro had nothing to apologize for. He no longer had to be slavish in his devotion to Cicero, and he duly honored the orator's memory by publishing a number of his speeches and letters posthumously. Tiro himself lived to the ripe age of 100, it was said, having spent at least half his years as a free man. "Happy is the man who remains far from the world of business," wrote the Roman poet Horace, "and who cultivates the family farm with his own oxen, who refrains from money-lending, who is not a soldier roused from sleep by the harsh trumpet or quaking in terror on a stormy sea, who avoids the form and the haughty thresholds of our more important citizens. Instead, he trains the mature tendrils of his grapevines to the tall poplar trees, where he stands in a secluded valley and surveys his herds of lowing cattle as they graze. This ode to rural pleasures was not quite as idyllic as it seemed, for the character who spoke these lines in Horace's poem was a businessman and moneylender who could afford to visit the country at his leisure, leaving the hard work of tending the land and livestock to others. Horace, writing around 30 BC, knew well that the sturdy farmer celebrated in Roman lore was a vanishing breed. Most of Italy's farmland was now in the hands of wealthy estate owners, like the late Cicero, who spent much of their time in the city and visited their holdings in the country periodically. Horace himself grew up in rural Italy, but found his calling in Rome. Born Quintus Horatius Flaccus in 65 BC, he was the son of an ex-slave who acquired some land in Apulia, a fertile region in southern Italy, but made his living chiefly as a public auctioneer, collecting goods from people who fell into debt and had to sell their property. Horace's father made enough from others' misfortunes to provide his son with a fine education, and his future looked bright. While studying in Greece, however, Horace met Marcus Brutus, who had fled Rome after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Horace sided with Brutus in the struggle that ended at Philippi in 42 BC with Brutus's defeat and suicide. Afterward, the land Horace's father had acquired was confiscated as part of an effort by Octavian and his fellow triumvirs to reward their supporters, often at the expense of their opponents. Horace went to Rome, where he was lucky to find work as an official clerk. In time, his literary talents won him entry to the circle of the hugely wealthless Gaius Maecenas, who had close ties to Octavian and had profited when Octavian's opponents were stripped of their assets. Maecenas patronized the epic poet Virgil and other brilliant writers, regardless of their political background, and restored Horace as a man of property by granting him a country estate. Horace had no illusions about what it took to live at ease in the country. Only a wealthy Roman, or one with a generous patron like Maecenas, could afford to enjoy days of quiet contemplation amid haystacks, beehives, and babbling streams. All others who hoped to survive in rural Italy had to work hard, and not many of them were their own masters. Most agricultural labor was performed by slaves, hired help, tenement farmers, or sharecroppers. By the late 1st century BC, many estate owners were turning away from slave labor for economic reasons. Grain and other agricultural goods were pouring into Italy from North Africa and other fertile places under Roman rule. Some of that grain was free, provided by subject provinces as tribute, and the imports lowered prices. In lean times, slaves still had to be fed and clothed at the owner's expense, while hired help could be laid off and tenants could be required to pay their rents or face eviction. Tenant farmers often had the additional duty of providing services for their landlord and patron by working a few days a year for him without pay. Nonetheless, some farmers who had lost their land recently through debt or confiscations preferred to work the soil for others rather than move to the city and join the crowds there queuing up for free grain doled out to prevent unrest. Among those who chose to remain in the country as a tenant farmer was Ophilus, described by Horace as an old neighbor of his in Apulia. Ophilus had once owned the land he farmed, but his property was taken from him and assigned to a veteran named Umbrinus, probably as part of the same confiscation that cost Horace's family their land. Ophilus stayed on the property as a tenant of the new owner. To Horace, he embodied rural virtues. In one of his poems, Horace praised Ophilus as a philosopher unschooled and of rough mother wit, and offered him as a model of thrift and fortitude in trying circumstances. You may see him on his little farm, now assigned to others, with his cattle and his sons, a sturdy tenant farmer, and this is his story. City dwellers who wasted their health and wealth at the banquet table, Horace noted, would do well to heed Ophilus, who was not the man to eat on a working day without good reason, anything more than greens and the shank of a smoked ham. And just because he was thrifty did not mean he was stingy. When guests arrived, Ophilus offered a pullet or a kid fresh from his yard, followed by a plain but tasty dessert of raisins and nuts and split figs. What more was needed than this? and a little wine to smooth out the worries of a wrinkled brow. As a poet, Horace was little concerned with the mundane labors that allowed Ophilus and family to meet their simple needs. Land had to be plowed and manured, seeds sown and rows hoed, plots weeded and watered. Then there were animals to be fed, milked and foaled, and in harvest time crops to be gathered, hay made, grapes squeezed, olives pressed, and grain ground. Nor did the short, wet Mediterranean winter provide rest for the weary, for there were fences to mend and roofs to repair. Most Roman farmers tried to leave part of their land fallow periodically. The resources of both the soil and the farmers must have been strained to the limit, however, when tenants had to make their rent. Ophilus and others in his position could sympathize with the farmer's lament. From the day of my birth I have lived by working my land. Neither my land nor I has ever had a rest. Perhaps the real Ophilus was less content with his lot than the man portrayed by Horace, but the poet knew what it was like to be dispossessed, and he admired the tenacity and forbearance that kept farmers like Ophilus attached to their land and their occupation, even if others reaped the benefits. Today the land bears the name of Umbrenus. Of late it had that of Ophilus. To no one will it belong for good, concluded Horace. Live then as brave men, and with brave hearts confront the strokes of fate. All around the Roman Empire there were countless men and women like Ophilus, people who might be free under the law, but who had to toil for others at a disadvantage. They were not entirely at the mercy of their landlords or employers, however. Some worked under contracts that spelled out what was expected of them and what they were owed in return. The terms might not be generous, but they were legally binding, and tenants and employees could appeal to the courts if they thought that a contract was being violated, just as their bosses could. Such disputes were usually resolved by magistrates who were supposed to rule impartially, based on the terms of the contract and on sound legal precedents. One intriguing case of this kind came before a Roman magistrate in AD 49, some 80 years after Octavian claimed the land. An advocate representing a man of means named Pissurus brought a complaint against a woman called Sareas. Pissurus had taken a male child from the dunghill, the advocate attested, and then had hired Sareas to serve as the child's nutrix or wet nurse. In many parts of the Roman world, parents left unwanted infants in desolate places to die or be taken up by others, usually as slaves. Pissurus contracted with Sareas to nurse this particular foundling, dubbed Heracles, evidently hoping that the boy would thrive and return an investment as a slave. Sareas was a free woman, but she must have been in considerable financial need to accept this job, for the wages offered a wet nurse were low, and a nursing contract might contain conditions that were strict and intrusive. Some contracts prohibited sexual intercourse by the nurse, for example, on the grounds that it would lessen her affection for the child or spoil her milk. There were few requirements for the job other than the ability to nurse a baby. Sareas qualified on that count, for she had just weaned a boy of her own. Although slave women sometimes served as nurses, it was not strictly a menial task. Nurses in Roman society not only relieved wealthy women of the burden of breastfeeding, a task some considered beneath their dignity, but often went on to serve as nannies or governesses of the children they weaned. Sareas, however, was engaged just as a wet nurse. She contracted to nurture the infant Heracles in her home for 2 years, and all seemingly went well. It was only after she returned the boy to Pissurus that the trouble arose. One day, Pissurus's advocate told the magistrate, Sareas burst into his client's house and took the child. The only defense she offered for her action, according to the advocate, was that the boy was not a slave at all, but free. This apparent mystery was cleared up in court by Sareas herself, who testified on her own behalf. She probably could not afford an advocate. The boy Heracles had died in her care, she confessed, which meant that she had to return to Pissurus the balance of the wages she had received from him in advance. Apparently, she and her husband could not afford to do so, for they concealed the death of Heracles and replaced him with their own little boy when the time was up. That child was older than Heracles, but Pissurus had no reason to complain if Sareas returned to him a child who was larger and stronger than expected. So much the better from the master's point of view. After parting with her natural child, Sareas evidently had misgivings and snatched him back. Now they are trying to take my own boy from me, she testified plaintively. The magistrate was no Solomon, but he did reach a decision that offered something to both parties. The boy in question was present in the courtroom, and he looked to the magistrate to be Sareas' child. If she and her husband would swear that Heracles had in fact died in their care, he ruled, they could keep their boy, provided that they repaid to Pisuerus the money they owed him. Pisuerus may have been disappointed by this ruling, for the boy was surely worth more to him as a slave than what little he would recoup from Sareas, but the judge saw no reason to compensate him for his unlucky investment in the ill-fated Heracles. As for Sareas, she might be poor and imprudent, but she was still free and entitled to certain rights, the judge concluded, and so was her son. Aside from slaves, everyone in Roman society had certain standing under the law. To be sure, those in disreputable trades, such as prostitution, had fewer rights than others. Prostitutes could not marry men who were free citizens by birth, for example, and the law did not allow them the same protection against harassment accorded other free women. Nonetheless, magistrates sometimes made significant legal concessions to prostitutes, or at least to their customers. Prostitutes were exempted from the laws against adultery imposed by Augustus, for example. In one celebrated court case, a prostitute by the name of Manilia took on one of Rome's leading officials and won. That dignitary, Aulus Hostilius Mancinus, wanted to bring charges before a jury against the prostitute for injuring him with a stone outside her establishment one night. In order to do so, however, he first had to make his case to Rome's tribunes, who held veto power over prosecutions they deemed unwarranted. Mancinus had a wound to show as evidence, and he even had a plausible excuse for visiting Manilia's apartment. In his official capacity as an aedile, he kept an eye on prostitutes and perhaps had the right to inspect their premises. But the prostitute Manilia was allowed a say in the proceedings as well, and she offered the tribunes a far different view of what Mancinus was up to that night. She testified that he had come to her home dressed not in his official robes but in his party clothes, including a festin garland around his brow, suggesting that he was looking for a good time. As it happened, she was otherwise occupied at the time, and it was not convenient for her to let him in. He then tried to force his way into her apartment, and she drove him off with stones. The tribunes agreed with her that there was no good reason for Mancinus to be calling on her at night in such informal attire. They threw out his case and upheld Manilia's right to refuse entry to a man wearing a garland, whatever his rank. Romans seeking to better their lot found opportunities not only in Rome but in scores of smaller cities that pulsed with their own vitality. Just 130 miles southeast of Rome, for example, lay Pompeii, home in AD 79 to at least 10,000 people. Nestled below Mount Vesuvius and surrounded by fertile fields and pastures, Pompeii took in wool, olives, and grapes from the countryside and turned out cloth, oil, and wine. A major earthquake had rocked the city in AD 62, damaging homes, public buildings, and the water system. A number of wealthy Pompeians had abandoned their homes afterward in favor of lavish new villas along the coast, but other residents stayed put and took part in the city's revival. Some enterprising tradesmen bought or rented the abandoned houses and converted them into workshops. Pompeii was girded by high walls and linked to the outside world by 8 gates. Docks along the Sarno River received ships from the nearby Bay of Naples. To enter the city on the weekly market day was to witness Pompeii at its most colorful. People passing through the gates encountered an array of inns, taverns, and brothels. Some visitors might linger there, but most people here on business would continue down the main thoroughfares, past shops and eating houses that catered to the crowds pacing the raised sidewalks, much appreciated in rainstorms when water streamed down the avenues. Throughout Pompeii, whitewashed walls provided a backdrop for political endorsements and commercial notices, many of them inscribed by the city's sure-handed scriptores or sign painters. For rent from July 1st, read one notice, street front shops with counter space, luxurious second-story apartments, and a townhouse. Such advertisements vied for wall space with graffiti. "This is no place for idlers," one property owner warned passerby. "On your way, loafer." Other writers pledged devotion to their sweethearts or scolded philanderers, such as one Restitutus, who had allegedly deceived many girls many times. One wit expressed his low opinion of the graffiti writers as a group. "I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins from supporting the stupidities of so many scribblers." In AD 79, Pompeii was still restoring its forum, badly damaged by the earthquake of 62. Here, as in other Roman cities, the forum was the center of public life, a bustling square surrounded by temples, law courts, and other proud structures. Even as the restoration was proceeding, one corner of the forum served as the marketplace, with porticos sheltering food stalls and a money changer's booth. Merchants and shoppers haggled in the crowded mall. Among the attractions was a domed building with a tank in the middle, filled with live fish, most likely so that customers could carry their pick home fresh. Pompeii was as much a city of scents as of sights. Sea breezes wafted the fragrance of roses from the many gardens throughout the streets, mingling with the aroma of bread from the bakeries, the smell of rancid bran dumped into the streets for the pigs, the heady bouquet of wine emanating from the vintners, and the tang of garum, the fermented fish sauce favored in the taverns and eating houses. But one distinct odor dominated the rest in certain areas, the insistent smell of urine, used with other ingredients as a detergent to wash wool in the dozen or so fooleries that washed new cloth and laundered dirty garments. The city's largest foolery was located on the Via Mercurio, just north of the Forum, in what had once been a private home. Some evidence suggests that the owner of this establishment, Lucius Veranius Hypsaeus, one of the city's leading businessmen and politicians. Fooleries catered to the desire of Romans to be neatly attired. Plain citizens wore togas that were off-white, the color of natural wool, but still needed cleaning periodically. Men of high status who aspired to public office wore togas that were pure white and had to be laundered frequently. Togas were a staple of the fuller's trade because most homes lacked the space or equipment to launder so large a garment, up to 20 feet by 10 feet. People also sent smaller articles, such as tunics, to the fullers if they could afford it. Just to have a tunic cleaned might cost as much as 4 sesterces, a day's pay to a laborer. Fullers in wool-producing areas like Pompeii also kept busy washing wool cloth fresh from the loom, which had to be cleansed of oil and dirt and otherwise prepared for tailoring. Hypsaeus, or whoever owned the big fullery, had his work cut out for him and wasted no time in getting to it. Like much of Pompeii, he would have risen at dawn and hurried to his place of business, where he greeted his staff or perhaps 24 employees, some of them freeborn, others slaves or ex-slaves, including children serving as apprentices. The owner had refurbished the building on the Via Mercurio to make it suitable as a fullery by installing big soaking and rinsing tubs, somewhat smaller treading vats, frames for bleaching the fabric, and a press for ironing. Perhaps to enlighten his customers or his new employees as to the business at hand, he had the various steps in the fulling process painted on a wall of the building. As revealed there in pictures, the first task was to wash the cloth in the treading vats, filled with hot water and detergent. Workers used their feet as agitators, trampling the fabric like grapes at a winery. The urine used in the detergent was collected in jars from the obliging employees and from male passerby, who knew that this was one place where they were always welcome to relieve themselves. It was then mixed with potash, carbonate of soda, and fuller's earth, a kind of absorbent clay, to form a caustic detergent. Unfortunately, the mixture also exposed the workers to skin ailments. After washing, the fabric was steeped in the big rinsing vats, wrung out, and dried. Fabrics that required bleaching were then placed on a conical frame over a smudge pot of burning sulfur, whose fumes constituted yet another health hazard for the workers. The cloth was combed when dry with a brush-like carding tool to raise the nap, which was then sheared off, leaving a smooth surface. Finally, the fabric was pressed in a vise in order to remove wrinkles. The fullers carried out their trade under the divine patronage of Minerva, goddess of wisdom and ingenuity, sometimes represented by an owl, a creature sacred to her. The fullers may also have had an earthly patroness in the form of a woman named Eumachia, the widow of a man in the wool trade and daughter of a brick magnate, who used part of the fortune she inherited to fund construction of an ornate structure at one corner of the forum known as the Building of Eumachia. The fullers honored her there with a statue, and the building may have served as the headquarters of the collegium or guild to which both the fullers and the wool traders belonged. Theirs was not the only guild in town. The carpenters, the plumbers, and other groups of tradesmen formed their own collegia for social and political purposes. Members of a guild often threw their collective support behind a particular candidate for public office, hoping no doubt that the man so favored would serve their interests if he won. The fullers asked you to elect Hulconius Priscus, read one sign touting a candidate for Duumvir, the highest office in town, shared by two men. Hypsaeus himself served as Duumvir. Men also formed associations for other purposes, including the funding of proper funerals for the dues-paying members. Then, as now, some of these clubs may have had odd titles. One candidate for office in Pompeii received hearty endorsements on the walls from groups identifying themselves as the petty thieves, the late drinkers, and the late sleepers. Perhaps these were genuine endorsements from associations with irreverent names, but more likely they were jibes at the candidate and his supporters by the opposition. There were other diversions to compete for his notice or the attention of his workers, including gladiatorial bouts in Pompeii's amphitheater, which was large enough to accommodate the city's entire population and then some. But when the workday ended, usually by early afternoon, after 6 hours or so of toil, there was no place more attractive to workers who had been inhaling sulphurous fumes or enduring other travails than the baths, with their inviting pools of hot and cold water. Both of Pompeii's public baths had been damaged in the big earthquake, and only one of them, the Forum Baths, had been fully repaired. A newer facility, the Central Baths, was under construction, but in the meantime at least some Pompeians were visiting smaller, privately owned baths like the one advertised on a wall in Pompeii. For rent, from August 13th, with a 5-year lease on the property of Julia Felix, daughter of Spurius, the elegant Venus Baths, street-front shops and booths, and second-story apartments. Like Eumachia, the owner of this property was a woman of means. Some women in Roman society inherited sizable fortunes from their deceased fathers or husbands and might own businesses or offer patronage to clients. The title of Julia Felix's establishment, Venus Baths, was fitting, for Venus was the patron goddess of Pompeii, and she was honored there in various ways. Sculpted and painted phalli adorned Pompeii's fountains and walls and protruded from doorways. No one considered themselves indecent in a city ruled by the goddess of love. Now and then, on their way home from the baths, perhaps, foolery workers who could afford it may have paid personal tribute to Venus by visiting one of Pompeii's many brothels. But chances are they popped in more often at one of the city's ubiquitous taverns. Just about every block had at least one, for a cup of hot wine, with a bowl of savory lentil stew on the side, perhaps. If they had time to kill and money to venture, they probably joined their drinking companions in rolling the dice, a passion that Pompeians shared with Romans everywhere. Win or lose, the workers and their boss had reasons to feel blessed. Their busy little city had many of the advantages of Rome without the congestion and fuss. It seemed that Venus was taking good care of Pompeii and her people, but fate could be fickle, as those who had lived through the last big earthquake could testify. As it turned out, that convulsion was just a hint of the fury awaiting Pompeii and nearby settlements. In August of AD 79, the earth shook again, and the tremors continued ominously for several days. Then, on the 24th, Vesuvius erupted, disgorging a vast plume of pumice and ash that descended like a plague on the people in the streets and at home. Slaves and citizens, rich and poor, native-born and foreigner, all perished as one in a deluge of volcanic debris that buried their communities, thus preserving the remains for posterity. Among the testaments that were unearthed at Pompeii in later times was an incomplete line of verse from the poet Virgil, scribbled on a wall by someone who was about to die, perhaps, and who had only time to write these words. All were silent. The message serves as a haunting epitaph for a city that once resounded with life and that, even in the deathly silence of its ruins, speaks eloquently of the collective accomplishments of the Roman people.